Consider the vast indifference of the cosmos, where each human life flickers like a distant star, unnoticed and ephemeral. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the mind wanders unchecked, one might ponder the fragile veil separating self from oblivion. This is not a tale of sudden catastrophe or heroic defiance, but a gradual erosion, a whispering invitation to dissolve into the infinite nothing that underlies all being. It begins, as such descents often do, with a simple curiosity about the nature of consciousness itself, a desire to peer beyond the illusions of individuality and purpose. In a forgotten coastal village, where the sea eternally gnaws at the cliffs, lived a circle of thinkers bound by their shared disdain for superficial existence. They gathered in an ancient lighthouse, its beam long extinguished, drawn together by the promise of deeper truths hidden in the shadows of philosophy. The eldest among them, a man whose eyes held the weariness of uncounted nights spent in contemplation, spoke first of the emptiness at the core of all things. He proposed that true understanding required not accumulation of knowledge, but a systematic dismantling of the self, layer by layer, until nothing remained but raw awareness of the void. As weeks turned to months, their discussions evolved into rituals of introspection, conducted in the dim glow of oil lamps that cast elongated shadows across the stone walls. They would sit in silence for hours, each confronting the internal chasm that yawned wider with every breath. The psychological strain manifested subtly at first, a persistent hum in the ears, as if the ocean's roar had infiltrated their skulls, echoing thoughts that were no longer entirely their own. One by one, they reported sensations of detachment, as though their bodies were mere vessels adrift on an unseen current, pulled inexorably towards some unfathomable horizon. The dread deepened when they began to perceive the interconnected frailty of their minds. What started as shared insights spiraled into involuntary exchanges, dreams bleeding from one sleeper to another, memories surfacing unbidden in foreign consciousnesses. The second thinker, a woman whose voice carried the cadence of forgotten liturgies, described it as a merging, not of souls, but of absences, a pooling of the hollow spaces within each of them, forming a greater emptiness that hungered for completion. This realization brought no enlightenment, only a mounting pressure, like the weight of deep water pressing against fragile glass, threatening to implode the barriers of identity. In this atmosphere of unrelenting introspection, the physical world began to warp in response to their unraveling psyches. The lighthouse stairs seemed to multiply in the darkness, leading not upward but inward, into labyrinthine corridors of thought that looped endlessly. Food lost its appeal, tasting of ash and insignificance. Sleep became a torment, filled with visions of infinite regression, cells within cells dissolving into fractal voids. The third member, a youth whose initial fervor had drawn them all together, confessed to feeling his essence fraying at the edges, threads of personality unraveling into the ether, leaving behind a shell that moved by rote, animated by forces beyond comprehension. The philosophical undercurrents grew denser, coiling around concepts of non-being as the ultimate reality. They delved into the terror of eternal recurrence, not as cycles of life, but as perpetual annihilation, each moment a fresh erasure of the self. The dread was not in death's finality, but in the endless prelude to it. The slow recognition that existence was a cruel illusion, a temporary scaffold over an abyss that claimed all things without mercy or meaning. Their dialogues took on a liturgical rhythm, chants of negation recited in unison, affirming only the inevitability of surrender to the formless. As the spiral tightened, the psychological horror intensified. Hallucinations of multiplicity, where each saw reflections of themselves and the others, distorted and fragmented, whispering accusations of inauthenticity. The fourth thinker, a silent observer until then, articulated the core agony, the realization that free will was a myth that their pursuit of truth was itself a predetermined plunge into madness, orchestrated by the indifferent mechanics of the universe. The pressure built like a storm front, compressing their thoughts into denser forms of despair, where joy, ambition, and connection were revealed as futile distraction from the fundamental isolation of consciousness. The tonal oppression settled like fog rolling in from the sea, muffling external sounds until only the internal cacophony remained, doubts amplifying into screams within the mind, echoing the philosophical impasse of being versus nothingness. They questioned not just their own existence, but the validity of all perception, leading to a paralyzing solipsism where the world outside the lighthouse dissolved into subjective phantoms. The dread was existential in its purity, a slow poisoning of the spirit that left no room for resistance, only acquiescence to the encroaching dissolution. Further into the descent, the group's cohesion fractured under the weight of shared unreality. Physical manifestations emerged, skin paling to transparency, revealing the chaotic pulse of veins that no longer carried mere blood, but the essence of unraveling thoughts. Voices overlapped in disharmony, each utterance a fragment of a larger, incomprehensible sermon preached by the void itself. The eldest spoke of the ultimate horror, the awareness that transcendence was not elevation but submersion, a drowning in the collective non-existence that awaited all sentient beings. The ideas spiraled outward yet inward, touching on the futility of legacy, how every achievement, every bond, was destined for erasure in the cosmic ledger, rendered meaningless by the scale of eternity. Psychological pressure mounted as they confronted the illusion of progress, realizing their rituals were not paths to wisdom, but accelerators toward obliteration. The woman's visions grew vivid, depicting realities where humanity's strivings were mere ripples on an ocean of indifference, destined to flatten into stillness. The youth's fervor twisted into terror, his body convulsing with the effort to retain a semblance of self amid the onslaught of depersonalization. He described sensations of expansion, not into godhood, but into diffusion, particles of consciousness scattering across the void, losing coherence forever. The Silent One's revelations added layers of dread. The universe as a vast mechanism of entropy, grinding down complexity into uniformity, with human minds as temporary anomalies fated for homogenization. In this ritualistic unraveling, the atmosphere thickened with unspoken admissions, the recognition that their gathering had summoned not answers, but an irreversible process of deconstruction. Emotional weight pressed relentlessly, evoking the sorrow of inevitable loss, not of life, but of the comforting fictions that sustained it. The dread was in the slowness, the inexorable pace at which autonomy slipped away, replaced by a communal dissolution that blurred the lines between individual and collective annihilation. Philosophical depths plumbed the horror of immanence, the divine not as a benevolent force, but as the all-encompassing nothing, absorbing all distinctions into undifferentiated being. They pondered the psychological toll of such insights, the mind's rebellion against its own erasure, manifesting as phantom pains of the soul, aches in the fabric of awareness itself. The spiral evolved, incorporating the terror of infinity, not boundless possibility, but endless repetition of the same futile questioning, trapped in loops of existential inquiry without escape. As the descent deepened, the lighthouse became a monument to their fading humanity, its walls etched with invisible scars of mental erosion. The group's interactions devolve into mirrors of mutual disintegration, each reflecting the other's crumbling facade. The eldest's calm recitations masked a profound inner turmoil, the knowledge that leadership in this venture was merely guiding others into the same pit of despair he occupied. The woman's liturgical tones grew hollow, echoing the emptiness she invoked, her words a dirge for the self she could no longer locate. The youth's convulsions symbolized the body's futile protest against the mind's capitulation, a physical echo of philosophical surrender. The Silent One's sparse utterances carried the weight of unspoken volumes, hinting at horrors too vast to articulate, leaving listeners adrift in implications of universal futility. The oppressive tone lingered in every pause, every breath drawn in the stale air, heavy with the scent of salt and decay. Dread accumulated like sediment, layering psychological burdens until movement itself felt laborious, each step a concession to the pull of gravity mirroring the gravitational force of the void on the psyche. Ideas spiraled into denser convolutions, the horror of realizing that suffering was not a trial but the default state, an intrinsic property of awareness in a meaningless expanse. Emotional gravity pulled downward, evoking the isolation of beings trapped in their own skulls, unable to truly connect, yet forced to witness each other's unraveling. The philosophical theme of absurdity resurfaced, twisted anew, life's pretense of meaning exposed as a cosmic jest, with their pursuit amplifying the punchline into eternal torment. Pressure built from within, as if the mind were a vessel overfilled with shadows, threatening to burst yet condemned to contain the overflow indefinitely. In the final phases of their convergence, the group experienced a collective fading, boundaries dissolving not into unity, but into fragmented echoes. The eldest perceived his thoughts as distant transmissions, fading signals from a self long since departed. The woman felt her essence seeping into the cracks of a lighthouse, absorbed by stone indifferent to her plight. The youth's identity splintered into myriad shards, each reflecting a different facet of dread, none whole. The Silent One became the embodiment of absence, his presence a void that drew others inexorably inward. The ritualistic narration of their decline continued unspoken, a sermon delivered through the silence of resignation. Dense horror saturated every moment, the psychological equivalent of black holes devouring light. Hope, purpose, individuality, all consumed without trace. The spiral concluded not with climax, but with perpetuation, ideas evolving into self-sustaining loops of negation, ensuring the descent's continuity beyond physical endurance. Yet the abyss remains open, its depths unplumbed, inviting further contemplation that promises only deeper immersion in the unrelenting dark. The thinker's fate hangs unresolved, a testament to the eternal draw of the void, where existence persists as an endless, heavy echo of its own futility, in the dim hours when sleep refuses to come, when the body lies still but the mind drifts like wreckage on black water. A particular thought sometimes surfaces uninvited. It is not fear in the ordinary sense, nor grief, nor even despair. It is quieter, colder, the slow realization that nothing inside you is truly yours. Not the memories you cherish, not the voice you recognize as your own, not the small rituals you perform to convince yourself the days of continuity. All of it borrowed, all of it on temporary loan from a silence that waits patiently to repossess everything. Imagine, then, a solitary room high above a sleeping city. Rain taps irregularly against the glass. A single lamp burns low. On the table before you rests an ordinary notebook, its pages still mostly blank. You have come here, not by invitation, but by the kind of compulsion that feels like gravity, to write down what remains when every comforting fiction has been methodically stripped away. You begin with the body. It is the most immediate betrayal. This lattice of meat and electricity pretends to be permanent, yet every cell within it is already rehearsing its own disappearance. You can feel it now. The microscopic sloughing of skin, the quiet apoptosis that prunes neurons hour by hour, the slow acidification of muscle that will one day refuse to answer the command to rise. The body is not a home. It is a rental agreement with an expiration date written in invisible ink. And the landlord never negotiates extensions. You turn the page. Next comes memory. It presents itself as a private archive, yet every recollection is already a forgery. Each time you summon your childhood street, the smell of rain on warm asphalt, your mother's voice calling you in for supper. The image is repainted by the present self, embellished, softened, censored. The original moment is gone forever. What remains is a series of increasingly inaccurate copies, each one farther from the event than the last. Memory is not preservation. Memory is erosion disguised as fidelity. Another page. Identity follows. You have spent decades assembling a name, a profession, a set of preferences, political opinions, moral stances, favorite songs, the way you laugh at certain jokes and not others. You wear this construction like armor. Yet examine any piece of it closely enough, and it crumbles into context, into mimicry, into accident. Your anger is inherited chemistry. Your kindness is conditioning overlaid on fear. Your deepest convictions are slogans you heard at the right developmental window and never quite dislodged. Strip away the scaffolding of culture, language, upbringing, trauma, reward. And what is left staring back is not a sovereign self, but a temporary knot in a much larger web of causes that stretches backward into deep time and forward into oblivion. The lamp flickers once. You keep writing because stopping would mean admitting the exercise is already futile. Now the room grows colder, not temperature, but ontological temperature. You reach the layer beneath identity, raw sentience, the bare fact of experiencing. I am aware seems at first to be the final rock, the one thing that cannot be doubted. Yet linger with that sentence long enough, and even it begins to fray. Awareness is not a substance, it is an event. It happens, then stops happening, then happens again in the next pulse of neural activity. Between pulses there is nothing, no experiencer, no continuity, only blankness pretending to be seamlessness. The self is not a flame burning steadily. It is a strobe light flashing so rapidly that the illusion of persistence is almost perfect. Almost. You turn another page, though your hand trembles now. Beneath sentience lies the final stratum, being itself. Not your being as such. The naked fact that something exists rather than nothing. Philosophers have circled this question for millennia and returned empty-handed because the question is malformed. Why is there something rather than nothing? Assumes that nothingness is the default state and existence requires justification. But stare long enough into the actual texture of reality and the hierarchy inverts. Nothingness is not prior. Nothingness is impossible. Existence is the brute, unchosen, uncaused fact, and it carries no meaning, no direction, no teleology. It simply is, and keeps on being, indifferent to whether any fragment of it becomes awake enough to suffer the knowledge. The rain has stopped. Silence presses against the windows like a second skin. You look at the notebook and understand that every sentence you have just written is already dissolving. The ink is not permanent. The paper is digesting itself molecule by molecule. The thoughts were never truly captured. They were only briefly slowed down on their way to dissipation. Even this moment of recognition, this tiny, anguished clarity, is itself already sliding toward the same unmarked grave that awaits every other event in the history of the cosmos. There is no next insight waiting, no revelation poised to redeem the labor, no hidden order about to disclose itself. Only the continuing fact of continuation without reason, without audience, without endpoint. You close the notebook, not because you have finished, but because finishing is another fiction you can no longer sustain. The lamp burns lower still. Outside, the city breathes in its sleep. Millions of separate illusions bumping against one another in the dark, each convinced of its own centrality, each destined to be erased without fanfare. And you, whatever temporary signature still clings to the word you, sit in the diminishing light, listening to the sound that has been playing beneath every other sound your whole life. The soft, patient, unstoppable machinery of unmaking. That never hurries, and never rests, that I in the vast architecture of night, where the boundaries between wakefulness and dissolution soften like wax under an unseen flame. A peculiar gravity asserts itself. It is not the pull of earth upon flesh, but of the unmanifest upon the manifested, the inexorable draw of what never was toward what briefly pretends to be. You might sense it in the quiet intervals between heartbeats, those infinitesimal pauses where the machinery of life hesitates, as if reconsidering its commitment to the charade. This is the threshold where questions no longer seek answers, but instead multiply into finer gradations of uncertainty, each one a deeper incision into the tissue of certainty. Consider, if you will, the act of breathing. It arrives unbidden, this rhythmic intrusion of air into the fragile cavern of your chest. Inhale, a temporary inflation of emptiness with more emptiness. Exhale, the evacuation of what was never truly possessed. With each cycle, you participate in a cosmic transaction, borrowing substance from the indifferent atmosphere only to return it unchanged. Yet linger on this process long enough, and it reveals its underlying mockery. The lungs are not instruments of vitality. They are bellows pumping illusion into a void that masquerades as a self. The oxygen you crave is not sustenance, but a delaying tactic, postponing the moment when the final exhalation merges you seamlessly back into the undifferentiated whole from which you were never truly separated. The hour advances, or perhaps it merely persists. Time, that most insidious of deceptions, unfolds not as a river, but as a stagnant pool, reflecting distorted images of past and future that converge into a single, featureless present. You have marked your days with calendars and clocks, imposing grids upon the formless to create the semblance of progression. But strip away these artifacts, and what remains is the raw continuum, an endless now that devours its own tail, where every ambition is already entombed in its outcome, every beginning a prelude to its own negation. The clock's ticking is not measurement. It is the sound of erosion, each second a granule of your allotted span ground finer, until it slips through the hourglass into oblivion. Deeper still, the inquiry turns to desire. That flickering impulse which propels the body through its routines, chasing shadows of fulfillment in relationships, achievements, sensations. Desire promises completion, yet delivers only escalation, a hunger that feeds upon itself, growing more ravenous with each partial satisfaction. Examine its roots, not in some noble quest for meaning, but in the fundamental incompleteness of being, the yawning deficit at the center of consciousness that no object or experience can ever fill. To desire is to affirm lack. To pursue is to prolong the agony of incompletion. And in the quiet admission of this, the psychological weight settles heavier, like sediment accumulating at the bottom of a forgotten well, compressing the spirit into denser forms of resignation. The room around you begins to participate in the unraveling. Walls that once defined space now suggest confinement, an arbitrary barrier against the encroaching infinite. The furniture, inert and familiar, takes on the quality of witnesses, silent observers to your gradual disassembly. Shadows lengthen not with the movement of light, but with the expansion of doubt, pooling in corners where forgotten thoughts congeal into shapes that hint at presences just beyond perception. This is not paranoia. It is clarity emerging from the fog of daily distractions, the recognition that isolation is not circumstantial, but ontological. You are alone not because others are absent, but because you is a solitary construct adrift in a sea of similar illusions, each one destined to disperse without trace. Philosophical tendrils extend further, coiling around the notion of language. These words you think, these symbols you string together to ward off the silence. They're not tools of communion, but veils of separation. Language fragments the seamless whole into discrete parts, assigning names to what defies naming, creating divisions where none exist. I is the first lie, a pronoun that carves a fictitious boundary between observer and observed. Speak aloud now, and hear the echo, not affirmation, but distortion, sound waves dissipating into air that absorbs them indifferently. The sermon of self-narration continues, but its congregation dwindles to one, preaching to a mirror that reflects only absence. The pressure intensifies, a subtle constriction of the psyche, as if the mind were being drawn through ever narrower apertures. Emotions, those turbulent currents you once navigated with purpose, reveal themselves as chemical artifacts, transient storms in a neural sea devoid of inherent significance. Joy is a fleeting elevation, sorrow a temporary submergence, both dissolving into the baseline neutrality that awaits their passing. To feel is to be reminded of impermanence. To reflect on feeling is to accelerate the fade. The dread here is not acute but chronic, a low-frequency hum that permeates every cognition, underscoring the futility of attachment in a realm where all bonds are provisional. Spiraling onward, the contemplation encompasses relation. Others appear as mirrors, not companions, projections of your own incompleteness dressed in foreign forms. Conversations are not exchanges, but echoes, each response a refraction of unspoken voids. Love, that exalted delusion, is merely the temporary alignment of two solitudes, destined to diverge as entropy asserts its dominion. Friendship, kinship, enmity, all variations on the theme of separation, brief intersections and trajectories that curve inevitably toward isolation. The horror resides in the dependency, the need for these illusions to sustain the greater illusion of self, knowing full well their transience renders them cruel. The night deepens without drama, its progression a testament to the banality of unraveling. No cataclysme watts, no revelation verst fort. Only the steady accretion of insight into non-insight, the layering of negations that build not toward understanding but toward acquiescence. The body, memory, identity, sentience, being, desire, language, emotion, relation, all peeled away like husks from a kernel that proves empty upon revelation. Yet the process endures, a ritual without priest or altar, conducted in the temple of a solitary skull. And in this endurance lies the heaviest burden. The knowledge that continuation is compulsory, that the machinery grinds on without consent or cessation, propelling the awareness through cycles of illusion and disillusion until even the capacity for recognition frays into static. The abyss does not stare back. It simply envelopes, patient and absolute, leaving no residue of what once imagined itself apart. In the shadowed vestibule of consciousness, where the veil between thought and its dissolution thins to transparency, a subtle inversion occurs. What was once perceived as the solidity of self now reveals itself as a provisional scaffold, erected over chasms that echo with the absence of foundation. This is not a discovery born of revelation, but of attrition, the gradual wearing away of certainties until the raw substrate emerges, indifferent and unyielding. You might encounter it in the mundane, the pause before lifting a cup to your lips, when a hand hesitates as if questioning its own allegiance to the will that commands it. Such moments accumulate, not as epiphanies, but as erosions, carving deeper channels through which the undercurrent of nullity flows unchecked. Delve, then, into the architecture of perception. It masquerades as a window onto the world, yet functions more as a prism, refracting the undifferentiated flux into colors and forms that the mind can tolerate. Sight, sound, touch. These are not faithful reporters, but interpreters, imposing order upon chaos to preserve the fragile equilibrium of sanity. Consider the eye, a gelatinous orb capturing photons that dance without purpose, translating them into images laden with invented significance. But peer beyond the retina, into the neural labyrinth where signals converge and the deception unravels. Every vision is a reconstruction, every auditory wave a fabrication, every tactile sensation a narrative spun from electrochemical whispers. Perception is not revelation. It is censorship, editing the intolerable vastness into digestible fragments, lest the full weight of reality crush the observer beneath its indifference. The inquiry presses onward, uncoiling into the realm of volition. You believe in choice, in the sovereignty of decision that steers the course of days. Yet trace any action backward through its causal chains, and autonomy dissolves into determinism, a cascade of prior states dictating the present with mechanical precision. The impulse to speak arises not from free agency, but from synaptic firings scripted by genetics, environment, and the accumulated detritus of experience. Will is not a force. It is a post hoc justification, a story told to conceal the puppet strings that jerk the limbs into motion. In this recognition, the psychological constriction tightens, a vice around the core of agency, squeezing until the illusion of control fractures into shards that reflect only helplessness. As the spiral descends, the atmosphere thickens with the residue of unspoken concessions. The air in your confines grows heavier, not with humidity or smoke, but with the density of accumulated negations, each layer adding to the oppressive mantle that drapes the spirit. Furniture creaks under invisible burdens. Floors sag as if bearing the weight of uncountable erased possibilities. This is the tonal gravity of existential subsidence, where the psyche settles into lower strata, compressing under its own mass until movement requires Herculean effort. The dread manifests as inertia, not panic, a reluctance to engage with a world revealed as a theater of absurdities, where every gesture is a futile rebellion against the entropic tide. Philosophical filaments weave tighter, ensnaring the concept of purpose. Humanity clings to teleology like driftwood in a storm, ascribing meaning to the meaningless to stave off the vertigo of insignificance. Careers, creations, legacies. These are talismans against the void, fragile constructs designed to outlast the constructor. Yet entropy mocks such endeavors. Books crumble to dust, monuments erode, memories fade into synaptic noise. Purpose is not inherent. It is imposed, a veneer over the brute fact of existence that persists without rationale or destination. To confront this is to invite the horror of superfluity, the dawning awareness that your every striving is a footnote in a text that no one reads, dissolving into the archival silence of cosmic irrelevance. The pressure mounts from subterranean depths, a rising tide of cognitive dissonance that floods the chambers of the mind. Beliefs once held as anchors now bob aimlessly, unmoored by the currents of scrutiny. Faith in progress yields to the spectacle of cycles, civilizations rising and falling in predictable rhythms, each iteration a variation on the theme of eventual collapse. Optimism curdles into resignation as the scales tip toward the inexorable. Species extinction, stellar burnout, universal heat death. The emotional sediment layers thicker, evoking not sorrow, but a profound numbness, the psyche's defense against the onslaught of futility that threatens to overwhelm. Venturing further, the contemplation engulfs temporality. Past, present, future. These are not distinct realms, but illusions of segmentation, imposed upon the eternal simultaneity of being. The past is not fixed. It mutates with each recollection, colored by the lens of now. The future is not open. It unfolds along paths predetermined by the inertial momentum of prior events. The present, that razor-thin sliver, is all that truly exists. Yet it slips away the moment awareness alights upon it, leaving only the ghost of experience. Time is not a gift. It is a thief, pilfering moments before they can be savored, accumulating losses until the ledger shows only deficit. The ritualistic cadence of introspection persists, a litany recited in the dimming light of comprehension. Words form on the tongue, unspoken yet resonant, affirming the inexorable dissolution that claims all constructs. The body, once a vessel of action, now feels like a relic, organs churning mechanically, oblivious to the obsolescence they sustain. Senses dull, not from age, but from overexposure to the banality beneath the surface. Colors leaching into gray, sounds blending into white noise, textures smoothing into uniformity. Emotional strata compress further, yielding the ore of isolation's purest form. Connections fray not from conflict, but from the inherent solipsism of consciousness. Each mind an island in an archipelago of incommunicability, bridges built of language that collapse under the weight of misunderstanding. Love devolves into transaction, friendship into convenience, society into a fragile consensus masking mutual alienation. The dread here is atmospheric, a pervasive chill that seeps into the marrow, reminding that true communion is impossible in a universe where every entity is fundamentally alone, adrift in its private simulation. Ideas evolve in tightening gyres, incorporating the terror of scale. The individual shrinks against the backdrop of immensity, planetary, stellar, galactic, multiversal. Efforts to matter dissolve in the dilution of deep time, where millennia are blinks, eons mere breaths. The philosophical horror intensifies, the realization that sentience is an anomaly, a brief aberration in the eternal equilibrium of non-awareness, fated to subside without legacy or echo. The descent perpetuates, a slow immersion into strata where light fails and pressure dominates. No bottom awaits, no terminus to the plunge, only the continuing envelopment, the patient absorption into layers of negation that accumulate without end. The psyche, once expansive, contracts into a singularity of acquiescence, where questions cease not from resolution but from exhaustion. Yet the machinery endures, grinding thought into finer dust, dispersing what remains into the indifferent expanse that claims no victors, only remnants to end the final attenuation. When even the act of questioning has worn itself threadbare, a peculiar stillness descends. Not peace, nor resignation, nor anything that might still carry the fragrance of meaning. It is the silence that remains after every echo has died, when the last reverberation of why has faded into the architecture of nothing. The room no longer feels like a room. Walls have lost the courtesy of definition. They bleed into floor, into ceiling, into the colorless expanse that once pretended to separate inside from outside. The lamp has long since guttered out, yet darkness does not arrive in its place. There is only the absence of distinction between light and its lack, a gray that is neither bright nor dim, simply neutral, the visual equivalent of apathy. You attempt to move a hand. The command is issued, travels along familiar neural highways, yet the limb remains indifferent, as though the message arrived at an abandoned address. There is no panic in this failure. Panic requires contrast, a belief that things could be otherwise. Here, the failure is already complete, already anticipated in every prior instant of illusory control. The body, that once loyal conspirator in the fiction of agency, has quietly withdrawn its participation. It continues to breathe because breathing is easier than stopping. The heart contracts because inertia is cheaper than arrest. These are not signs of life so much as administrative inertia. The universe, too, indifferent even to bother canceling the contract. Thought itself begins to stutter. Sentences that once arrived fully formed now fracture mid-flight. Words hang, incomplete, like smoke that cannot decide whether to rise or fall. The mind, that tireless narrator, finds its vocabulary shrinking to a handful of monosyllables. Is, not, was, gone. Even these feel extravagant. Eventually, they too will be surrendered, not through decision, but through exhaustion. The same way a flame does not choose to go out, but simply reaches the end of its fuel. What remains is not emptiness in the poetic sense. Emptiness still implies a container, a space waiting to be filled or mourned. What remains is prior to emptiness, the condition in which the very notion of container and contained has never arisen. No observer, no observed, no witness to report the absence of witnessing. The universe does not notice its own unwitnessing because noticing would require a vantage point, and vantage points have become obsolete. Somewhere, very distantly, a sound might register. The soft click of a cooling filament, the creak of wood settling, the irregular drip of water finding its way through unseen cracks. These are not interruptions of the silence. They are the silence wearing different costumes. They pass without commentary, without an audience to assign them significance. The cosmos continues its indifferent churning. Galaxies wheeling, stars igniting and guttering, black holes patiently digesting light, none of it accelerated or delayed by the cessation of one small, temporary locus of self-regard. There is no final sentence, no summarizing aphorism, no parting image to carry into the dark. The script does not conclude. It simply stops being written. The hand that held the pen no longer recognizes the obligation to move. The page, half filled, half blank, remains exactly as it is, neither artifact nor waste, just another object among objects, slowly oxidizing into unrecognizability. Outside the window, if windows still meaningfully exist, the city breathes on without pause. Cars pass. A dog barks twice. Someone laughs at screen. None of it requires justification. None of it registers the small, local termination of one node of awareness. The machinery of continuation turns without sentiment, grinding tomorrow out of today with the same mechanical courtesy it has always shown. And so the descent reaches, not an end, because endings imply narrative shape, but a condition of having already been finished before the telling began. The weight remains, distributed now across the entire field of what is, no longer localized in any single point of suffering. The sermon is over. The preacher has forgotten both the message and the need to speak it. Only the listening continues, without ears, without expectation, without